The room was a cage of gilded plaster and suffocating perfume. Dozens of young women, daughters of the financially desperate aristocracy, were arranged like porcelain dolls on satin chairs, their mothers hovering behind them with the anxious energy of auctioneers. Lord Ashworth, my father, stood beside me, his hand a heavy, proprietary weight on my shoulder. Across the room, the man they called the Iron Duke, Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, moved with a predator's economy. He was spoken of in whispers, a man forged in some private grief, his fortune vast, his heart a locked vault. His face was all harsh angles and shadows, his eyes missing nothing. He was not looking for a love match. He was acquiring an asset. My father had positioned my sister Rosamond slightly forward. She was the jewel of our crumbling house, her hair the colour of spun gold, her skin flawless, her smile a practiced art. She was perfect. I was her shadow, the elder sister, the one with the mind for numbers that had kept our estate afloat for 5 years. And the scar that marred the left side of my face, a puckered silver line from temple to jaw. It was a relic from a nursery fire, a testament to pulling Rosamond from a burning cradle while the nanny screamed in the hall. It was a story my father never told. The Duke's gaze swept the room once, a cold assessment that dismissed half the candidates in a single pass. He paused on Rosamond. My father straightened, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial murmur meant only for the Duke's ears, yet I heard it perfectly. "She's the pretty one," he said, a merchant pointing out his prize mare. "A true English rose." The Duke's eyes, the colour of a winter storm, did not linger on Rosamond's beauty. They moved deliberately past her, past my father, and settled on me. The silence in the room stretched thin and tight, like a drawn bowstring. He saw the scar. He saw the plain grey dress I wore, a stark contrast to the frills and lace surrounding me. He saw, I felt with a sudden, unnerving certainty, the ledger books in my head and the quiet defiance in my spine. He walked toward us, his boot heels clicking a funereal rhythm on the marble floor. He stopped not before Rosamond, but before me. He did not smile. He simply looked at me for a long moment, an appraisal so intense it felt as if he were weighing my very soul. Then he offered his hand, a large, unadorned thing in a black leather glove. His voice was low and resonant, a sound like stone grinding on stone. "You," he said, "you will do." My father's jaw fell slack. Rosamond's perfect smile faltered, but I simply looked at the Duke's outstretched hand. It was not an invitation, it was a summons. It was a business transaction offered in place of a life sentence. I placed my fingers in his palm. His grip was firm, cool, and absolute. As he led me from the room, the door closing behind us felt like the turning of a key in a lock, sealing my old world away forever. If you enjoy stories of strength found in unexpected places, subscribe for more. We love to hear from our viewers, so please let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The life that led Ilara to this moment was one of quiet fractures and uncredited labour. At Ashworth Manor, beauty was the only currency of value, and Rosamond was the mint. Ilara was the clerk who counted the coins. From the age of 15, she had been the true master of the house. While her father entertained guests and Rosamond practised her watercolours, Ilara was in the dusty estate office, her fingers smudged with ink, untangling the snarled mess of their finances. She renegotiated with tenants, found more efficient crop rotations, and tracked every shilling with a ferocity born of necessity. Her father would take her meticulously prepared ledgers, copy them in his own hand, and present them to his solicitor as proof of his own acumen. She was never acknowledged, never thanked. Her competence was simply a resource to be exploited, like the timber in the West Wood or the coal in the ground. The cruelty was rarely overt. It was in the silences, the omissions. At dinner, guests would praise Lord Ashworth for the estate's surprising solvency. He would accept with a modest nod, never once glancing at the daughter who had made it so. It was in the way her mother, before she passed, would sigh when fitting Alara for a new dress. "We shall use a darker lace on the left, dear, to draw the eye." The scar was treated not as a mark of courage, but as a shameful defect, a flaw in their otherwise marketable goods. Her only true ally had been a young housemaid named Sarah, who would bring her warm milk and honey late at night in the office, her presence a small, silent acknowledgement of Alara's unseen work. Sarah was dismissed for breaking a vase Rosamond had knocked over, and Alara learned the hard lesson that loyalty in her world was a liability. Her engagement to Lord Fenwick had been a matter of contract, not affection. He was handsome, charming, and the heir to a neighbouring property they desperately needed to absorb. When he spoke to her, his eyes had a habit of focusing on her right ear, as if the left side of her face did not exist. He praised her quiet nature, her sensible mind, mistaking her exhausted vigilance for demure compliance. He never once asked her about the books she read or the work she did. He saw her as a necessary component of an advantageous merger. The betrayal, when it came, was swift and bloodless. It arrived in a letter, on Fenwick's elegant stationery, delivered on a silver tray. The engagement was dissolved. His regrets were expressed in prose, so polished it was insulting. Later that day, her father summoned her to his study. He did not soften the blow. "Fenwick has made a more advantageous match," he'd said, avoiding her eyes. "We are ruined, Alara, utterly." He explained that Fenwick's withdrawal had triggered a cascade of called-in debts, loans he had taken against her dowry, against the estate itself. The creditor, a man he had never met, was demanding immediate and full repayment. There was only one solution. The Duke of Blackwood, a man of immense wealth and fearsome reputation, was seeking a wife. He had agreed to settle all of Ashworth's debts in exchange for a daughter. The choice of which daughter, it was assumed, would be obvious. "He will take Rosamond, of course," her father had said, a statement of fact. "And you, well, we shall have to find a place for you. Perhaps as a companion to your great aunt. A life of quiet servitude, a ghost in another woman's house." That was to be her reward for holding their world together. The journey to Blackwood Manor was conducted in a silence as deep and heavy as the velvet squabs of the Duke's carriage. Alistair sat opposite her, a formidable silhouette against the fleeting landscape of bare, branched trees and grey winter sky. He did not speak, and Alara, who had long ago learned the art of occupying small spaces, did not venture to break the quiet. She watched the rhythmic clench and release of his jaw, the only sign of life in a face that seemed carved from granite. This was not the silence of comfort, but of containment. It was the quiet of a man who had no words he wished to spend. The manor rose from the mist-shrouded fens like a fortress. It was a vast, imposing structure of dark grey stone, its lines severe and its windows like watchful eyes. There were no climbing roses on its walls, no welcoming lights in the lower windows. It was a house built for endurance, not for joy. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of beeswax and old stone. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, the dark wood panelling gleamed. But there was a stillness to the place, an absence of life that went beyond mere order. It was a house holding its breath. A housekeeper, a tall, severe woman with hair pulled into a knot so tight it seemed to tug at the corners of her eyes, met them in the great hall. "Mrs. Gable," the Duke said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This is the Duchess. See to her things." Mrs. Gable gave Alara a swift, appraising glance, her expression betraying nothing, and inclined her head a fraction of an inch. A young maid, her face pale and her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity, curtsied low. "This is Anna," the Duke added, almost as an afterthought. "She will be your personal maid." He led Ilara not to a drawing room, but to his study. It was a room that suited him perfectly, large, dark, and dominated by a massive oak desk. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines a somber tapestry of leather and gold leaf. A fire burned low in the grate, offering the room's only warmth. He did not ask her to sit. He stood behind his desk, a general addressing his subordinate. "The terms of our arrangement must be clear," he began, his tone as flat and factual as if he were discussing crop yields. "I have settled your father's debts in their entirety. You will want for nothing in terms of material comfort. This house, its staff, and its accounts are now your domain. I expect you to manage them efficiently and without fuss. You will be my duchess. You will act as my hostess when required. You will present a respectable and placid front to the world. In return, you will have my name, my protection, and the security of this estate." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "What I will not offer," he said, the words precise and cold, "is companionship, or affection, or any other sentiment you might have been led to expect from a marriage. My work requires my full attention. You will find my company infrequent, and my interest in domestic affairs non-existent. Do you understand?" Ilara looked at this hard, unyielding man, and felt not fear, but a strange, liberating relief. He was not pretending. He was not hiding his indifference behind false smiles or empty courtesies. He was offering a contract, stark and honest. Cold indifference was a climate she could survive. It was the cloying humidity of false affection that had always threatened to suffocate her. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace," she said, her own voice steady. "The terms are acceptable." For the first time, a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, crossed his face before it was gone. He simply nodded. "Very well. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms." The first few weeks at Blackwood Manor were an education in silence and shadow. Ilara learned the rhythms of the house, the ghostly quiet of the servants moving through the corridors, the precise chime of the grandfather clock in the hall marking the lonely hours, the way the winter light crept across the stone floors and retreated without ever seeming to bring warmth. Her rooms were in the east wing, a suite of chambers that were spacious, clean, and utterly impersonal. The Dukes were in the west wing. They might as well have been in different houses. They saw each other only at dinner, a formal, silent affair at opposite ends of a dining table long enough to host a state banquet. He would read documents between courses, and she would eat, the scrape of her fork against the porcelain the only sound in the vast room. She did not wait for his permission to begin her work. She asked Mrs. Gable for the household ledgers. The housekeeper's eyebrows rose a fraction, but she produced them without comment, 3 enormous dust-covered volumes. Ilara spent her days in a small, sunless morning room, her pen scratching across the pages. She found what she expected: order, but not efficiency. The estate was solvent but stagnant, run by tradition rather than strategy. She found a supplier for household linens who had been overcharging them by 20% for a decade. She discovered that the steward, a surly man named Croft, was selling surplus grain from the home farm for his own profit. When she presented her findings to the Duke one evening, laying the evidence out on the polished surface of the dining table, he examined the papers without a word. He looked at Croft's falsified records, then at the new supply contract she had drafted. He raised his eyes to hers, and his expression was unreadable. "Croft will be dismissed in the morning," he said. "Implement the new contract." That was all. There was no praise, no surprise. But in his world Ilara was beginning to learn, Swift, decisive action was the highest form of acknowledgement. She began to explore the manor. She found a sprawling wing on the north side of the house, its furniture shrouded in white dust cloths, the air thick and still. Anna, the young maid, whispered that it had been the late Duchess's wing, his mother's, and had been shuttered for 20 years. But it was the gardens that drew her. They were a vast, tangled wreck. Once proud rose bushes choked by weeds, stone paths disappearing into overgrown thickets, a beautiful glass conservatory with several panes cracked and broken. It was a perfect metaphor for the house itself, a place of forgotten beauty left to ruin. She found the head gardener, a man named Mr. Abernathy, with hands as gnarled as an old oak root, living in a small cottage on the edge of the property. He had been kept on, he explained, but with only one assistant, had been ordered to tend only to the kitchen gardens. The ornamental grounds had been left to die. Elara spent hours with him, poring over the original planting plans she'd found in the library. Together they began the slow, arduous work of reclamation. She would spend her afternoons in the cold, damp air, her hands raw, and her borrowed gardening dress stained with earth, clearing weeds and pruning back the dead wood. The Duke began to watch her. She would feel his presence before she saw him, a shadow in a distant window, a still figure at the far end of a corridor. One evening she stayed late in the library, a vast two-story room that was the beating heart of the house. It was the only place that felt truly warm, truly alive. She was perched on the rolling ladder, retrieving a book on horticulture, when she realized he was there, standing by the fireplace, simply observing her. He held a glass of brandy, the firelight glinting on its amber surface. He did not speak, but he did not leave. They shared the silence for nearly an hour, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of turning pages. It was not companionship, but it was a form of coexistence, a shared space carved out of the vast emptiness of the house. The staff noticed the change. Mrs. Gable began to consult her on menus. Anna started to smile in her presence. Elara was no longer just the Duke's strange acquisition. She was becoming the Duchess of Blackwood, not by name, but by the quiet, steady work of her own hands. The library became their unspoken territory, a neutral ground where the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a shared quiet. Elara spent her evenings there, working on the estate plans at a small writing desk near the fire. One night, while searching for a book on land drainage in the archives section, her hand brushed against a loose panel at the back of a deep shelf. It shifted. Curious, she pressed it, and a section of shelving swung inward, revealing a small, hidden alcove. It was not a secret passage, but a concealed office, barely large enough for one man. A single oil lamp sat on a narrow desk beside a stack of locked leather folios. A key hung on a small hook just inside the door frame. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was his private space, the true sanctum of the house. She knew she should close it, walk away, and forget what she had seen. But the folios were labelled by year, and one bore the name of her own family, Ashworth. Her hand trembled as she took the key from the hook and fitted it into the lock. It turned with a well-oiled click. Inside were not just financial records, but a story told in receipts, letters, and contracts. She saw it all laid bare. The Duke of Blackwood had not simply paid her father's debts. He had spent the better part of a year methodically purchasing them from every creditor her father had. He was the sole architect of her family's ruin. He had owned them, completely, long before he ever set foot in that gilded drawing-room. But there was more. Tucked at the bottom was a thin file containing correspondence between the Duke's solicitor and a man who held Lord Fenwick's gambling markers. Letters detailing a carefully orchestrated campaign to apply financial pressure, to make Fenwick's position so untenable that breaking his engagement to Elara and pursuing the shipping heiress became his only viable option. The air in the small room grew thin and cold. This was not a rescue. It was a strategic demolition. He had not saved her from a collapsing house. He had set the charges himself. The cold, indifferent man who offered a business arrangement was a fiction. Beneath it was a calculating predator who had moved every piece on the board to get exactly what he wanted. And what he wanted, for reasons she could not begin to fathom, was her. The discovery was a shard of ice in her gut. The fragile trust she had begun to build, the quiet respect she had started to feel, all of it fractured. The foundation of her new life was not a contract. It was a conspiracy. She took the Ashworth folio, closed the hidden door, and walked back into the firelight of the library to wait for him. He found her there an hour later, standing by the fire, the leather-bound folio on the mantelpiece like an indictment. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes going from her face to the book. His expression did not change, but a stillness descended over him, the absolute calm before a storm. He closed the door softly behind him and walked into the room, his gaze never leaving hers. He did not feign surprise or ignorance. He simply waited. "This was you," she said, her voice quiet but shaking with a cold fury. "All of it. My father's debts. Lord Fenwick, you engineered the entire collapse." He inclined his head. "I did?" The simple, unadorned admission was more shocking than any denial. "Why?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why go to such lengths to acquire a wife you claim to have no interest in, to possess a title you already hold? What was the purpose of such a cruel, elaborate game?" He moved to the fireplace, standing opposite her, the folio between them. "It was not a game," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "It was an extermination. Your father and Fenwick are parasites of a type I know all too well. They feed on the inheritances of women, leaving ruin behind them. My own mother was a victim of such a man, her own brother, who bled her dowry dry and left her a shell. I have spent the last decade identifying these men and dismantling their lives, piece by piece, from the shadows." Elara stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. "So this was just another campaign for you? Was I simply spoils of war, a trophy to hang on your wall?" "I needed to get you out," he said, the words clipped. "They would have taken everything from you and discarded you within a year. I saw the accounts you kept. I knew you were the one holding that house together. I did not intervene for your father's sake or even for yours. I intervened because I will not suffer men like that to prosper." The explanation was brutal in its honesty. He had not seen a woman in need of rescue. He had seen a valuable asset in the hands of the enemy. It was a cold comfort, but it was a truth she could grasp. Before she could form a reply, a soft knock came at the library door. A young footman entered, his face pale. "Your Grace, I am sorry to disturb you. There is a visitor, a Lord Fenwick. He is most insistent on seeing the Duchess." A muscle jumped in Alistair's jaw. Elara's blood ran cold. Fenwick was here, the ghost of her past life, standing in the hall of her new one. Alistair looked at her, a question in his eyes. It was the first time he had ever truly asked for her lead. "Show him into the blue drawing room," she said, her voice finding a sudden, unexpected strength. "The Duke and I will receive him together." Lord Fenwick was arranged by the fireplace in the blue drawing room, affecting an attitude of handsome concern. The room was cold, rarely used, and the colour of a winter sky, a fitting stage for this confrontation. He turned as they entered, his face breaking into a practised, sorrowful smile directed entirely at Elara. He ignored Alistair completely. "Elara, my dear," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I came as soon as I heard. Your father is beside himself with worry, to be forced into this arrangement with this man. He finally flickered a look of contempt at Alistair, who had taken up a position near the door, a silent, brooding sentinel. You need only say the word, and I will see you safely away from here. We can put a stop to this travesty. He was playing a part, the gallant rescuer, the spurned lover. He saw her as the same frightened, overlooked creature she had been in her father's house. He did not see the woman who had spent the last 2 months rebuilding an estate, commanding a staff, and unearthing the secrets of the man who now stood guard in her name. The past and the present were colliding in this cold, blue room, and Alara found she had no desire to return to what she had been. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "There is no travesty, Lord Fenwick," she said, her voice resonating with a calm authority that surprised even herself. "Only a series of transactions. My engagement to you was one such transaction, which I believe you were no longer solvent enough to complete." Fenwick's smile tightened at the edges. "That is a vulgar way of putting it. I was concerned for your welfare." "Were you?" she asked, taking a step forward. "Were you concerned for my welfare when you conspired with my father to use my inheritance to cover your own debts? Were you concerned when you planned to cast me aside once the funds were depleted? My husband," she said the word deliberately, a claim of territory, "has been far more honest about the nature of our contract." The mask of concern dropped from Fenwick's face, replaced by a sneer. "You would choose this brute, this recluse, the man the whole of society whispers about? I am offering you a return to your life, to your name." "The life you speak of was a cage, my lord, and my name is now the Duchess of Blackwood." She turned her head slightly, letting the light catch the scar on her cheek. "This is a place where things are seen for what they are. I have no desire to return to a world that only values perfect surfaces." Fenwick's charm curdled into pure malice. He took a step towards her, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You will regret this. I will tell everyone how he bought you like cattle, how he holds you here against your will. I will ruin you both." Before he could take another step, Alistair moved. He did not rush, did not raise his voice. He simply glided from the doorway to stand between Fenwick and Alara, a wall of silent, absolute menace. "You will leave my house," Alistair said, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the room. It was the sound of controlled violence, more terrifying than any shout. "You will not speak my wife's name again. You will not think it. If I hear so much as a whisper of your slander, I will dismantle what little is left of your life so thoroughly that your own creditors will not recognize the dust. Am I understood?" Fenwick, for all his bluster, was a coward. He visibly shrank back, his face pale. He stammered something incoherent, turned, and practically fled the room. The sound of the great front door slamming shut echoed in the silence. Alara and Alistair were left alone, the air still crackling with the aftermath of the confrontation. They had not acted as rescuer and victim, but as allies. For the first time, in this cold, formal room, they felt like a partnership. The library was warm, the fire casting long, dancing shadows across the shelves. The tension from the drawing room had followed them, a humming energy that filled the space between them. Alara stood tracing the faded coastlines on a large terrestrial globe, the smooth, worn wood cool beneath her fingertips. Alistair was by the window, staring out into the blackness of the night, his back to her. An hour had passed in this charged silence. She had been waiting for him to retreat, to withdraw back into the fortress of his solitude, as he always did. But he remained. Finally he spoke, his voice rough, as if dredged from a great depth. He would have destroyed you, slowly, a piece at a time, until there was nothing left but a pretty, vacant shell for him to display. You knew that from the beginning? She stated, not as a question, but as a fact she now understood. He gave a slight, sharp nod, his reflection barely visible in the dark glass. I have made a study of such men, their appetites, their methods. My father was a scholar. He collected books. I collect monsters, and I learn their anatomies. There was another long pause, the only sound the soft hiss and pop of the logs in the grate. When I saw you in that room, he continued, his voice softer now, more hesitant than she had ever heard it. Standing beside your sister in her shadow, I did not see what your father wanted me to see. He saw a flawed product. I saw a survivor. I saw a woman who had been holding a crumbling dynasty on her shoulders and hiding the strain behind a quiet face. He turned from the window at last, and the look on his face was one of raw, unguarded vulnerability. It was as if a mask he had worn for decades had finally cracked. I told myself I required a duchess who was sensible, efficient, uncomplicated, a partner in a practical enterprise. I did not want a pretty doll I would have to entertain. I wanted a fortress. He crossed the space between them in 3 slow strides. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. I did not know, he said, his voice barely a whisper, that the fortress would have a garden inside. He lifted his hand slowly, as if not to startle a wild creature. His gloved fingers did not touch her skin. Instead, his thumb gently, reverently, traced the puckered line of the scar on her cheek. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body. It was the first time anyone had ever touched the mark with anything other than clinical pity or revulsion. He looked at it not as a flaw, but as a feature of the landscape of her face. "This is not a blemish," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "It is a testament. It is proof that you are a woman who runs toward the fire, not away from it." He let his hand fall, but his eyes held hers, and in their stormy depths she saw the walls of his own fortress beginning to crumble. The annual Blackwood Gala was the pinnacle of the London season, a formidable event held in the family's city residence. It was to be Alara's formal debut as the Duchess of Blackwood, and she knew the whispers would be a storm around them. She descended the grand staircase on Alistair's arm, her gown a simple, elegant sheath of midnight blue silk that left her scarred cheek bare to the world. She had refused the hairdresser's attempts to arrange her curls to conceal it. She would not hide. Alistair's hand was a warm, steady presence on her arm, his expression unreadable, but his proximity a silent declaration of solidarity. As predicted, the whispers followed them like a rustle of dry leaves. She caught snippets. "Bought her, you know. Paid the father's debts. And so plain, and that awful mark." Lord Fenwick was there, of course, holding court near the champagne fountain. He was the centre of a circle of influential peers, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom as he painted a picture of Alara as a tragic prisoner, a poor, coerced creature, trapped in a marriage to a monstrous recluse. He was poisoning the well, ensuring her social ruin before she had even been introduced. Alistair's jaw tightened, but before he could move, a path cleared through the crowd. Sir Robert Peel, the Prime Minister himself, was approaching them, his face lit with a genuine smile. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to Alara first, a pointed gesture of respect. "A pleasure to finally meet the woman who has the entire Ministry of Agriculture in an uproar." A confused silence fell over the nearest guests. Fenwick's smug narration faltered. Alara looked at the Prime Minister, bewildered. "Sir Robert, I am afraid I don't understand." "Your new model for tenant farming contracts, Your Grace." he said, his voice booming with enthusiasm. The Duke was good enough to share your proposal with my office, the one that ties rent to yield rather than a flat rate, incentivizing land improvement and crop rotation. It is revolutionary. We've run a trial on 3 Crown estates in Kent, and the initial reports show yields are up nearly 15%. 15%. It is the most brilliant piece of agricultural strategy I have seen in a decade. He turned to the now silent crowd. The Duke of Blackwood has not just found a wife, Sir Robert announced. He has found the keenest strategic mind in England. The air in the ballroom shifted. The whispers died, replaced by murmurs of awe and respect. Elara felt a flush rise to her cheeks, not of shame, but of pride. Her work, her mind, the skills she had honed in secret for years, were being celebrated in the most public way imaginable. She glanced at Alistair. The cold mask was gone entirely, replaced by a look of such fierce, undisguised pride that it took her breath away. He lifted her hand from his arm, turned it over, and pressed his lips to her palm in front of the Prime Minister and half the aristocracy of London. Then he looked directly at her, his voice clear and resonant, meant for all to hear. "My Duchess," he said, "is an asset to the nation." Lord Fenwick stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the architect of his own public humiliation. He had tried to define her by her supposed weakness, and had instead borne witness to the undeniable proclamation of her strength. He faded back into the crowd, his power utterly broken. Alistair tucked her hand back into the crook of his arm, the gesture both possessive and protective. "Shall we, my dear?" he murmured, his voice for her alone. They moved through the ballroom, no longer a subject of gossip, but a portrait of power. Months later, spring had finally come to Blackwood Manor. The gardens, which had been a tangled ruin, were now a testament to patient, determined work. The paths were clear and gravelled, the stone walls mended, and the first of the old roses were beginning to open, their petals the colour of clotted cream and pale blush. The air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and new life. Elara and Alistair walked the central path side by side, the silence between them no longer a void, but a comfortable shared space. It was a silence built of late nights in the library, of shared meals that were no longer formal, of small unspoken kindnesses, a book left open to a passage he thought she might enjoy, a cup of tea she had Anna bring to his study when he worked too late. They stopped beside a newly restored fountain, its water murmuring softly over moss-covered stone. Anna had told her it had not worked in over 20 years. Alistair had quietly hired 2 stonemasons from the village to repair it, a silent gift to her and the garden she was resurrecting. He turned to her, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression serious. "I made you a promise when you first arrived, Elara," he began, his voice steady and plain, the same tone he used for matters of fact. "I promised you a roof and a name, security and my protection. It was an insufficient offer." He looked around at the blooming garden, at the great stone house that now felt less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary. "This is not just a roof. It is your home. You have brought it back to life, just as you have brought order to my own affairs." He took a step closer and took her hands in his. His grip was warm and sure. He met her eyes, and the winter storms in their depths had finally given way to a clear, calm sea. "The contract I offered was for a duchess, but that is not what I have found. What I have found is a partner. What I have found—" He paused, the word seeming to cost him a great effort, yet he said it with absolute certainty. "Is my wife, in all the ways that word is meant to be understood." He did not say the word love. He did not need to. The truth of it was there in his hands, holding hers, in the quiet gravity of his gaze, in the simple, profound statement of fact. It was a declaration more powerful than any flowery poetry, an acceptance of a reality that had grown between them, as steady and sure as the roses climbing the garden wall. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of complete trust and belonging, and felt his arm come around her, holding her close. The transaction was complete. The contract had been fulfilled, and in its place, something real and vital and whole had taken root. They stood together for a long time in the garden they had restored, two solitary people who had, against all odds, become one. Thank you for joining us for this story. Would you have trusted a man who orchestrated your entire world? Let us know your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The best alliances, after all, often begin as the most honest transactions.